the high-tech Poldark is something that is a bit of a strange name, but it probably is accurate.
I'm not going to ask you to take off your shirt, Jeremy, to show us.
I may be the new Poldark, but I guarantee I will not take my shirt off.
Well,
The next 10 years is going to be incredible change, and we will look back in 2034 and think, what on earth are we doing driving around with a chimney sticking out of the back of the car?
welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am Richard Delevan, and I am wearing a hat. I will not be taking questions at this time. We have a great show for you. Two-parter, really relevant for the week that's in it, and the air is still abuzz with reactions and fallout from the Labour Party conference, and whether the new government's decisions are really going to put the UK back at the front of the pack for climate tech, encouraging businesses like Cornish Lithium, which is a standout example of a company literally doing the hard yards to build a domestic critical mineral supply chain for batteries. But with companies like British Volt going the way of the VOODOO and Northvolt in Sweden announcing layoffs with major customers and canceling orders, who's going to buy it? That's the question we asked our distinguished panel of observers and experts, including Ben Cooke, Earth editor of The Times, Freya Pratty, senior climate tech reporter at Sifted.eu, and Ben Kilbey, who knows a thing or two about a thing or two in this space, as the founder of the consultancy VOODOO. So thanks for joining us, and make sure you're getting the most out of these by subscribing at wickedproblems.earth to get these episodes ad-free into your inbox before anybody else. And in a week where even The Guardian is chasing a nonsense story about freebies of clothes and football tickets, now more than ever, we think spaces like this one, where we can actually cut through the nonsense and talk about what's really going on, is important. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And if you're not, the chances are you're not, and you think these are worth your time, please consider helping us to help keep this going. Right, enough begging bowl, and let's kick off my conversation with Jeremy Wrathall, founder of Cornish Lithium. Jeremy Wrathall from Cornish Lithium, thank you so much for joining us on Wicked Problems.
Thank you, Richard, and great to be on the show.
So Cornish Lithium has been a company I've been my eye on for really quite some time, not just because I love going to the Duchy and hanging out on the South Coast, but also the fact that the idea that the mining heritage in Cornwall, that you guys are helping to bring it back. I saw there's a headline in the Telegraph referring to you as a high-tech Poldark. So from Rachel Millard from 3 years ago, which I'm sure she's probably a little bit slightly embarrassed about now. But look, I mean, you guys have had some really interesting news lately. Have been designated a nationally significant infrastructure project.
Yeah.
Tell me about the project. Tell me why getting this kind of recognition is significant.
Look, I think the high-tech Poldark thing is quite amusing, but remember that Poldark originally in the early 1700s, late 1700s, was feeding copper and tin to the Industrial Revolution. This is feeding what I think is the irreplaceable, in fact, Volkswagen said it themselves, the irreplaceable element of the renewable transition. And we have to have lithium. I mean, lots of people think, going to be hydrogen or it's going to be something else, but let's face facts. If you think about electric cars, okay, they've slowed down a little bit, particularly in the Western world, but overall they're still growing very, very, very fast, particularly in China. And if you think about maybe there's a switch to hydrogen, some people think about that. There's only 6 hydrogen charging stations in the UK. There are 74,000 electric vehicle charging stations. So facts, lithium-ion battery or lithium battery is going to be with us for a long time. We are sourcing the material for that energy transition. And also, of course, let's not forget that it's great to have renewable power from wind and solar, but it needs to be stored because wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So you've got to have big batteries. In fact, there's one big battery being installed in Cornwall right now. It's a 50-megawatt battery. It's going to store power from solar and wind. So it's going to be a lithium-ion battery. So it's really, I think that we are rightly possibly being the Poldark, the high-tech Poldark is something that is a bit of a strange name, but it probably is accurate.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to ask you to take off your shirt, Jeremy, to show us.
I will
the whole thing,
guarantee.
but
That's the one thing I guarantee. I say to everybody, I may be the new Poldark, but I guarantee I will not take my shirt off.
well, Well, look, so like if you're listening to this on audio only, you'll be disappointed to find out that Jeremy actually has taken off his shirt and is displaying his abs. But for those people who are on video, what's actually going on, it's fine. Look, we'll go on because we're talking this week, Jeremy, in a week where the Labour Party conference, new government, 79 days in, has happened and are very much majoring on the energy transition and all the things you're talking about. We're also talking during New York Climate Week, where there's lots happening in terms of the discussion about your sector, both in critical minerals and like the broader infrastructure for the energy transition.
Yeah.
But here in the UK, I mean, you guys had received some funding, and again, I can't remember if that's equity or debt or what kind of exactly the structure that was, but the government has actually noticed you guys for a while. This new designation is actually obviously really great to add impetus to that. But what is your view about the current environment in the UK for encouraging a business like yours, doing this kind of extraction for critical minerals? And what would you like to be seeing more of? I believe you had some colleagues on the ground there in Liverpool at the conference. So, like, are there things that you're hoping to see in terms of changes of policy in the UK to actually help you guys succeed?
Look, I think, yeah, there's a lot going on globally, as you referred to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US getting more and more determined to help to secure domestic supplies of lithium, other minerals as well. The FT article referred to nickel as well, recent FT article.
Mm,
And I think in the UK, there's no doubt we came to this very late in the party. The Conservative government did, to be fair, wake up, but they woke up late.
mm,
And I think one of the ministers actually said to me, we were thinking about that we're fine, we import everything, and then suddenly we realized the Inflation Reduction Act has happened in the US, which is one of our allies, and then we had the EU Critical Minerals Act, and we were facing off against not a great relationship with China, and suddenly realized we're on our own. And on our
mm,
own we are because of Brexit as well. So I think what's happening here is a realization that to secure a to actually capitalize on the energy transition, we need to reindustrialize. We've got the Labour Party government talking more and more about an industrial strategy. Thank goodness for that, at last. And that energy, that industrial strategy will, I'm sure, and for what we've been hearing, focus on offshore wind. It will focus on all the energy future energy sources, and therefore it will have to focus on electric vehicle manufacture and critical minerals by definition, because we're going away from an era of burning stuff like burning fossil fuels to an era which is going to be dedicated, what is going to be, which will hinge around interaction between atoms, lithium, sulfur,
mm.
uh, phosphate, whatever it is in that battery. And those minerals don't grow on trees; they have to be extracted from the ground. That's simple as that. And people say, "Well, what about recycling?" Well, we've been using copper for 4,000 years. It's about 24 million tons of copper used a year, and only about 60%, possibly a little bit more, a little bit less, is recycled even now. So we're going to have to extract it. And I think the UK government recognises that and recognises that we have got the right geology here. And we've proved that. We've proved that you can extract lithium from the ground economically. Everyone asks if we need a special price. No, not necessarily. The lithium is a little bit depressed at the moment, but let's bear it in mind it was massively higher.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about this because again, so we've had Ernest Scheider from Reuters who wrote The War Below, big book on critical minerals, came out I think last year, earlier this year. We've had folks from Zenobi who, of course, not an OEM, but certainly deal in battery kind of storage systems, both for charging and for stationary storage for grid, as well as some others who are so yeah, listeners will be au fait with your space to some extent, as well as a cobalt refiner trying to re-onshore stuff to the States. But you mentioned the variability and the volatility of the price of lithium.
Yeah,
So I guess my question is, in terms of the project itself, obviously there are many flavors of lithium.
yeah,
Like you guys are, as I understand it, the main project that you guys are on is kind of mining it out of the rock,
yeah,
as opposed to doing something with seawater,
yeah.
which might expand your capacity. But how much does the volatility in the price affect kind of where you guys see the opportunity? Because again, I mean, I would not have your risk appetite for wanting to get into a mineral sector where one day it can be, I'm making this up. Let's just see, it's 100, and like the next day it could be 20
Yeah,
in terms of the price you could actually get per ton
sure.
of the stuff. So like, how do you cope with that?
It's very difficult. I think it's the only, and I've been doing commodities all my life, pretty much. The only commodity which has been more volatile is oil, which went during Gulf crisis and stuff like that went shot through the roof. We saw lithium price go from $6,000 a ton to $84,000 a ton in a year, and then 2 years later, we're sort of back down to $10,000, $12,000 a ton. It's very difficult to secure finance in that sort of environment
Mm.
because nobody wants to build a lithium mine when the price is down. Everyone wants to build a lithium mine when the price is up, which is precisely the wrong way round. You should build a lithium mine when the price is down so that you can take advantage of the price when it comes up. So it's very difficult to get your head around that. And I'd answer it in a different way because the same problem is true of offshore wind, onshore wind, hydrogen. A lot of the government, the UK government, took a policy of creating contracts for difference for hydrogen and onshore wind. Now, whether that could happen in lithium, I would like that to see to have that in critical minerals because you then,
Mm.
if the price is volatile, the government shares some of the pain. If the price goes up and through the roof, the government same shares the gain. So, yeah,
That's really interesting. I've not actually heard that proposal before in terms of the idea of extending it to that. I mean, again, it makes sense in the broad spectrum of the idea that governments have encouraged, for security of supply reasons, production of fossil fuels in the past.
yeah,
The idea that lithium would be crucial for securing future supply chains makes complete sense. But I want to ask you about like just in terms of the market space, because I mean, look, it's not been a great couple of years,
no,
and obviously this week we had 1,600 jobs that were eliminated from Northvolt in
yeah,
Sweden.
yeah,
We had British Volt as a UK national champion potentially,
sure,
and we've had Ben Kilbey on the show before, and he'll be on, I think, again after this interview, who bears the scars of that experience.
exactly.
But I guess my question is this: I mean, like, Jeremy, who's going to buy the lithium you're going to take out of the ground, and why should the UK government secure supply?
Okay. Eh, long question there. Who's going to buy the lithium? Well, just 2 hours drive up the road, we've got the Agratas Jaguar Land Rover new battery factory being built right now, actually being built. That will
Right.
be up to 40 gigawatts of capacity, which will require 40,000 tons of lithium carbonate
Is that
equivalent.
so? So it's all LFP, that particular factory.
It could be, but it will require a lot of lithium, whether it's LFP,
Okay.
whether it's solid state, semi-solid state. That's the technology which really excites me is solid state.
Mm.
And you
I
don't
want to come to that
necessarily.
later,
Yeah,
definitely, for
let's come to
sure.
that in a second.
CATL's announcement, for sure,
Oh
yeah.
yeah, that's really exciting. So yeah, but it could be LFP, it could be all sorts of battery chemistries. But anyway, it's going to need that much lithium. So I think that the most important thing is if Britain is not to fall behind in the race for electric vehicles, which it cannot afford to do because it's such a big percentage of our GDP. It's about 4% of our GDP. It employs
Mm.
directly and indirectly six to 800,000 jobs, blah, blah, blah. It's a symbol of national pride. We love our Land Rovers and our Rolls Royces and stuff like that. So we can't afford to let that go. Of course, that's exactly what China wants. It wants us to become
Mm.
completely dependent on their electric vehicles. So, but we don't want that. So if that's going to happen, we do need access to those raw materials and we need access to low carbon techniques to manufacture them. So we're not driving around in material using material that's been processed in China using fossil fuels and exported over the sea through using fossil fuels and has a high carbon footprint and also is not secure. So I think that so going back to the British fault, going back to Northvolt unfortunately really had a difficult time. They overextended themselves, I think it's fair to say, in branching out into other things, which, in my view, stick to the knitting, do what you say you're going to do on the tin. And British Volt, again, we're going to the government saying if you don't put your hand in your pocket, the project will fail. What we've
Mm.
successfully done so far with our project is to go to the government but we've already secured the capital. We got the government along for the ride. So that government funding from the UKIB, which was equity, crowded in a lot of funding from Energy and Minerals Group from the US and TechMet from Dublin. So
Right.
really, it's not just going to the government with a begging bowl. It's say, look, if you want to come along for the ride, that's great. Otherwise, we'll have funded ourselves. And I think that's possibly where British Volt fell down. And it was just a massive, massive amount of money. It's $1.4 billion. It's and Northvolt's even more.
Mm.
Our requirements are much, much smaller than that, and much more bite size.
And let's talk a little bit about that because again, we're again, I set the scene. We're talking in a week where lots of discussions are happening around what policy should be. You guys have been an early beneficiary. I think you were the first investment from UKIB, if I'm not mistaken, or one of the first anyway
First
in
equity,
that
yeah,
particular
yeah,
domain. Yeah.
first equity.
Um, and so I saw a report. I think again, you flagged this: the idea that the UKIB has a lot of more kind of dry powder, but hasn't deployed it in the space. People are talking about a national wealth fund, putting another 7 billion into play
Mm,
by this new government. So, but I guess the question is like the numbers are great, like super big numbers, but is the structure wrong? Is the idea that like are the things that could be learned from what's happening in the states or what's happening in other jurisdictions in terms of the idea that how that money could be otherwise allocated to make it more attractive
sure.
for project finance, for investors,
Yeah.
for what does that mean for you?
I think that we can take a leaf out of the book of the Department of Energy in the US only last week, where they allocated 225 million twice to two
Mm,
lithium projects in the US to enable capital formation to occur. So they said we will shoulder some of the burden along with others in Standard Lithium's case, Equinor out of Norway,
yep.
in TerraVolta's case, Energy Minerals Group, same shareholder as we've got. So to enable what we call capital formation, it's very scary for most investors to go into what is a very long-term industry. You don't get any return for years, and most people want a return in 3 months. So it's that capital formation which enable the government putting money in via grants, via equity, via whatever, helps to make that capital formation and those investors to come in knowing that they've got big shoulders as well to
Mm.
lean on.
So, I mean, I want to come back to something I touched on before, which is basically off takers, customers,
Mm,
right? So you mentioned Jaguar, right, the
yeah,
plant up the road, but given the struggles that the sector is going through, I guess the question is there any concern if we're trying to envision a world where the again, we'll maybe I'll ask you about this in a second, but this announcement this week about the mineral security partnership, which is going to have the idea of a counterbalance to China being able to like have alternative sources of critical minerals
yeah.
in the supply chains, and hopefully you guys play an important kind of node in that story. But the question is like again the demand within that space. I mean, for you for that to be successful in your mind, you mentioned Brexit. Is it enough to have a domestic supply chain? Is it enough to have domestic off takers? Or do we need to be thinking about carve outs for accessing, if we want to make the argument that basically this is so important
Mm,
that we need to make sure that we as a block, as the MSP, can access at a very low trade barrier,
yeah,
offering commodities within that space, which would include essentially tariff free provision of that commodity to Europe, to North America, to Japan, to South Korea,
yeah.
et cetera, wherever else and India, wherever else that partnership is going to extend. Is that where your head goes in terms of like what's required to actually make it sing, or like if we all are stuck in this domestic supply chain only, is there enough custom for you here to make that work?
I think it's a mix, Richard. I don't think we're going to be able to by 2030 supply more than 50% of the domestic requirement for the UK. Therefore, we are going to be still dependent on imports. Look at Japan. Japan is going to be totally dependent on imports.
Mm,
Uh, uh, Taiwan, Korea, the same, and actually Europe doesn't produce a
mm,
single. kilo of very, very little domestically supplied lithium right now. There is
Hmm.
interestingly already a company called Leverton Helm in Basingstoke in the UK, which is actually bringing in raw materials from Chile and elsewhere and refining them. And they've been doing it for
Oh.
years under the radar screen. It's very interesting to have them here. And we just announced a partnership with them last week. So I think the thing is that every ton of material that we import, we are exporting the economic activity in creating that material here to somewhere else. We're exporting that job, that economic value add to China, which we happily do. Most of the stuff we buy is from China
Hmm.
now. So, but I think it's going to be a mix where you can get domestic security. You should, and that's what the US is trying to do. That's what the EU is trying to do. But I can't think. There's very few lithium deposits I can think of which in Europe which are actually going to work. There's a couple, maybe three, but those are very very challenging indeed. But yeah, it's a mix. I mean, in my view, you should, if you've got the right geology, you should aspire to produce it as best you can. Otherwise, you're economically dependent on somebody else, and you're exporting the opportunity to somebody else.
And what's the cost difference between the extraction that you're doing and the extraction in somewhere like Chile? Because obviously it's a huge factor, right?
That is a massive factor. I think that it's probably un. Let's say unfair is not the right word. Chile's been extracting lithium for decades because they have a geographical advantage. They've got these massive salt pans up in the Atacama Desert, which are being uh, lithium's being extracted there for very cheap because they've got high amounts of sunshine, they've got very low rainfall.
Mm.
To really try and compare yourself with Chile is going to be difficult, but we are using what's called a new technology for our brine operations, where roughly the company is 50-50 between hard rock, as you mentioned, and brine, which is
So, and
subterranean
this is
brine.
something called DLE, is that right?
DLE.
Do I have that right?
Yeah, we'll be
Right.
using direct lithium extraction, DLE, to extract lithium from that brine. That is still very much in its infancy in terms of commercial extraction. But when I
Mm.
started the company, there were two technologies. There's now well over 50. So we're getting there very, very, very fast. And we
Right.
think we will be well within the middle of the cost curve, the existing cost
Mm.
curve, right, with that DLE right now. But the cost curve is still being formed. We're going at the moment this year, we're about 1 million tons of demand for lithium, 1.2. In 6 years now, nearly 5 years, we're going to need to go to 3 million tons, possibly even higher in terms of demand for lithium. Where's that 2 million ton delta going to come from? There's going to
Mm.
a whole new cost curve is going to be built out. And at the moment, that those mines are simply not being built because at the moment it's very difficult to attract capital.
So, I mean, if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is that essentially, if Britain wants to be any kind of seat at the table in this game, that like they need to understand like, the economics of this over the long term to build scale, to be able to invest in technologies, and so therefore, like, but there also are strategic reasons that are not necessarily like lowest cost kind of thing initially, which says that it's worth their while to make sure that there is domestic supply of this critical mineral,
Yeah,
and particularly because the chemistry wars seem to be favoring lithium a lot more now in the last couple of years.
yeah,
Poor Northvolt, NMC based,
yeah,
God bless them. But, lithium LFP seems to be, gosh, kind of headed in the right direction. So
sure.
essentially, your argument is that the reason that it's both strategic from a national perspective and from this MSP block perspective is that like there are just only so many sources of supply,
Yeah,
and we have to make it work in places that we can feel secure that we're going to get it from.
that's
Is that right?
exactly true. And if you think about the chemistry you referred to, P and other battery chemistries, what is coming? Well, see, LFP will only get your car 300 miles on a single charge.
Well,
Yeah,
let's talk about that
yeah.
because like we're coming to. I want to ask you about CATL, right? So, but anyway, finish your point. Sorry.
I mean, I think the chemistries are changing, and really, I think it's important that we do if we are going to stick with current battery chemistries, we need to try and build out secure supply if we can. But going to the next point is that if what the difficult thing is to prejudge what is happening with battery chemistries
Right.
coming rapidly down the pipe, and that is solid state, which will be transformative. Now, the raw materials for solid state are different, and ultra pure lithium chloride is needed, which is exactly what we produce from our brine. ultra pure lithium
Ah.
chloride. So,
Happy days for you then.
oh, it's great.
Just to be super clear, like solid state, I mean, as I understand it, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but like, so you're the expert, I'm not. But like, my understanding is that solid state, what it offers as a potential possibility is like just like it does in batteries, in laptop batteries,
Yeah,
like super fast charging,
yeah,
longer battery life, and a vehicle that translates into longer range.
correct.
Is that about right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that MG, which is obviously Chinese, but they are bringing out a 600-mile range car with a 10-minute charging time later this year or early next.
Really?
There's an LFP car in China, which you can buy apparently in Holland right now. It's got a 1,000-kilometer range and it charges really quickly. And
Wow.
interestingly, even one of our team who just recently bought a new electric car, he said he used to get to Exeter services, have time to go and visit this facilities, get himself a bacon roll and a coffee, do a few emails, and he plugged his car in. He had to go straight back and take it off the
That's
charge.
too
It was
fast.
fully charged.
Too fast.
So quick. So it's happening
Oh
very,
man.
very fast. And battery technology, battery uh, chemistry is evolving very, very quickly. It was interesting. I went to Cambridge University to visit the new Henry Royce battery suite, and most of the students there are working on solid state. So it's coming quick.
Really
Yeah,
interesting. Okay. And then final thing before I let you go, because just to geek out on this for a second, because I love the fact that you're so into this, and even like I feel like I've kind of read in, but slightly, and like 10% as you are, is like CATL, the Chinese manufacturer, one of the dominant kind of manufacturers in
sure.
the world of battery packs and cells, announced that they had like this within 10 years. They say they're going to have something with a what is it, 600,000 mile life
Yeah,
on a battery, which they're going to warrant, I
right.
guess,
Yeah,
going forward, which is like insane. Which is like, what's the? I mean, the average life of an ICE engine car is, I mean, good day 150 200K
yeah,
before you have to swap out an engine major
yeah.
component. But the idea that like you're going to be able to get 600,000 kilometers out or miles out of the battery pack is just nuts.
It,
So
it does
I mean,
seem
like
nuts.
it feels like
I
right.
I think there's a guy. I'm pretty sure there's a guy who's driving around in a Tesla that's done a million miles. I know it's staggering. These things just carry on going. But I'm not surprised to hear that CATL will do that. It's going to be amazing. The next 10 years, it's going to be incredible change, and we will look back in 2034 and think, "What on earth are we doing driving around with a chimney sticking out of the back of the car?"
Exactly.
So
Oh,
exciting.
Jeremy Wrathall, Cornish Lithium, we wish you the best for the future. And there's so much more I could ask you about, but we've already kept you over time more than I promised. So, like, I'm super excited, super grateful you could join us. And I hope you'll come back to update us on your progress.
It would be a great pleasure. Thanks, Richard. Great to be on the show.
Many thanks to Jeremy for coming on the show. And next up, we've got our panel discussion. Lots of lively stuff happening this week. Hope you enjoy it. Gosh, so privileged we could get this assembled such a distinguished panel with me to talk about the events of this week and some of the things in the news and some things coming up. Or Ben Cooke, Earth editor at the Times, Freya Pratty, climate tech reporter, amongst other amazing things at Sifted, the FT-backed publication covering startups, and Ben Kilbey, communications expert extraordinaire. Thank you all for coming on the program.
Great to be here.
Great to be, good to be here.
So, Ben Cooke, we wanted to come to you first. I
Yeah.
think that you have, like myself, been keeping a very close eye on some comments this week. As listeners may know, we were in Liverpool over the weekend and earlier in the week at the conference. Labour Party, new thing, but actually Ed Miliband, for those people who are super energy geeks, kind of trailed some of his thoughts and comments at a speech that he gave at the Energy UK conference last week. And I know you were focusing on that very laser-like. So, Ben, what was your take on Ed Miliband's comments there?
So what really caught my eye in Ed Miliband's speech to Energy UK last week was where he said, we're going to take on the obstructionists, we're going to take on the blockers to roll out wind and solar across the country as quickly as we can. Now, what I thought was interesting about that was Ed Miliband's quite deftly overlooked exactly who those obstructionists are. And of course, those obstructionists are normal people who are in community groups up and down the land who do not want wind farms and solar farms disrupting their views. And the reason why that interested me, the reason why him overlooking that interested me, is that I think it really gets to a dilemma Labour, I think, will increasingly find themselves in, where they're really talking some quite aggressive talk on the renewables rollout. They want to triple solar by 2030, double onshore wind. And on the whole, these things are popular. But the people with whom they are unpopular really, really oppose these wind farms and solar farms. I was in Mid Wales last week speaking to some people who do not want the Radnor Hills to be filled with wind farms. And they said that they felt they were not getting any kind of reward or any sufficient reward for hosting this infrastructure. So I think Labour really have a question facing them of exactly how they're going to live up to their manifesto commitment to reward communities who host all these new turbines and panels and pylons and so on. And for me, that was a glaring omission, both in Ed Miliband's speech and at Labour conference. I didn't come across any concrete proposals for how they might reward these communities, whether, for instance, they would offer them discounts on their energy bills, which is one measure which has been talked about, but no decision has been made. So, yeah, that's what caught my eye this week.
And I think that came up definitely, I think, across conversations that I'd had when I was in Liverpool, as well as even in public on the panel discussion that we had of again, I think lots of people heard the Ed Miliband speech at Energy UK, as well as some previous verbiage from him and Chris Stark and others. It's like, yeah, so the message is we're going to lower bills. Yeah, but when? When is that going to happen and for whom?
Ooh.
And we've had folks like Greg Jackson from Octopus basically saying, well, the only way that's going to happen for local communities who are actually going to sponsor and host these things is going to be local pricing. And the industry's like, yeah, we're not going to talk about that just now. So yeah, lots can be spilled between cup and lip, as they say. So we will see how some of the policy stuff actually gets decided. We just played my interview with the founder and CEO of Cornish Lithium, who have government backing and support to be able to actually, dig up both hard rock lithium, and they have some ambitions to do things with brine and whatever other kinds of lithium that might be there in Cornwall, kind of reviving the mining industry there, as the idea that this could be the anchor for a big effort to bolster the supply chain, both in the UK and more broadly in Europe. And my question to him, as people would have heard, is we've had some rough stuff lately in Europe, right? We've had British Volt, which we can discuss, and I hope we will, with if Ben Kilbey is willing to go there, what happened with that. But Northvolt at the moment, the European champion for battery production, has also had an interesting week where they've had to announce layoffs. Jeremy from Cornish Lithium had some thoughts about why that would be and their ambitions, and maybe they spread themselves too thin too quickly, and now they have to retrench. But Freya, you've been following Northvolt for really quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
So can you give us some insights about from your reporting about what, first of all, just to recap for listeners who might not be following it as laser-like as you or I, what's been happening with Northvolt and why does it matter?
Yeah, so a few weeks, there have been whispers of trouble for quite a while. They then in July announced a strategic review of their sites. I think that the idea of spreading themselves too thin was starting to come about then. There was this need to focus in on one factory, the factory in Sweden, which is what they've then announced that they're going to do. So last week they announced the closure of a cathode plant in Sweden and some R&D facility in America. And they haven't said anything about they've got factories in the works in Germany and Canada. We still don't know what's going to happen with them, but all focus is now on the main plant in Sweden. And they teased last week that there will be some layoffs this week we found out it's about 20% of the workforce. It's 1,600 people. But yeah, it's a big change from, they are, as you said, the kind of poster child of climate tech. They're the best funded. They're the golden child. So it's a big switch around.
And again, because you've been covering the company so closely, and again, like you say, like they were the poster child for so long. I mean, again, I suppose we'll be keeping a very eager eye out for your reporting because you've developed so many good sources there over the years. But can you give us any early hints about things you're hearing? I mean, again, like, so there are various theories. Like, one is the very, like, doing too much too quickly, diversifying, spreading your bets too much. Another is that their bet on battery chemistry relies on nickel, manganese, and cobalt, the NMC thing. And essentially that seems, as a battery chemistry, to have been slightly gone out of favor in favor of cheaper technologies that might be less dependent on places where they're hard to source these minerals. Like, are there any other things that you're hearing or in the ether about, like, why they hit the wall, or like what the strategic review might actually reveal in terms of like what they can do about it? Like, pivoting entirely on a battery chemistry seems like that'd be pretty tough.
Yeah, so the big challenge they've had was when BMW cancelled this $2 billion order. They've now gone for a South Korean provider, I think it is. And the big question now is, BMW's order was very small compared to someone like Volkswagen. I can't remember, I think that's a $14 billion order. So if that falls behind or is cancelled, that's when things get really tricky. And then now the question is on, or the way it's being talked about in the press, Northvolt haven't come out and sort of come down on either side on this, is who's going to give them the money to carry on for a bit. There's talk of Volkswagen, but they have their own problems. There's talk of Goldman Sachs because they're one of the biggest shareholders. The Swedish government ruled out direct help. So it's kind of a waiting game to see who'll put their hat in the ring to help. But falling behind on these off-takes, because off-takes are incumbents taking a real bet. And I think if one car company sees one fall behind, it's a real turn. And for, not just for Northvolt, I speak to so many smaller companies that are trying to get offtake agreements signed, and that BMW order has scuppered it for them as well. It's kind of faith in a wider industry that's at stake. That's not really an answer, but that's the kind of question people seem to be asking this week.
No, it's super valuable. I mean, interesting. I mean, is it, I can't remember now, but is it LG, or like what's the South Korean company that's actually scooped that up?
I think that is right. Wait, let me check. I think you're right. I think that's
right. It wasn't a quiz.
Well, that's right. I was like quickly giggling. The other thing I'm now focused on is there's so much public money wrapped up in Northvolt, in equity and loans and debt agreements. I don't think anyone's fully kind of written out how much that's worth. It's billions, and it's all under different agreements. So there's a lot of pressure in Quebec now, the government, to state exactly how much they've handed over and what the conditions for more are. So I think that's the next question, is like the taxpayer money here.
And I even saw, like, there's even, like, again, a migrant rights group in Sweden that's actually quite concerned because so many people were given visas to come over to Sweden to work at Northvolt, whose jobs now seem to be in peril. And given the amount of debt, like, there's some questions around that. So, like, obviously we hope for the best for anybody who upended their life to go and work towards that goal at Northvolt. But crikey, yeah, I mean, I suppose it's always important, I think, that on shows like this, that we remind ourselves that it's not just kind of dollars and cents and like what happens with Goldman Sachs or anybody else. Like, there are real people who decided, like, to buy into the vision, change their life, move to a different country, put themselves at risk by doing this. And as anybody who's ever worked in a startup knows, sometimes that works out, but sometimes it doesn't. But the question is, like, what happens after that? So we will keep an eye on that. So following on from something Jeremy said about, like, again, like, my question to him was, like, where is going to be the buyers, the off-takers, as Freya rightly is keeping track of in a supply chain. So if you're digging up lithium in Cornwall, a couple of years ago, you would have said, like, yeah, British Volt's going to be like my main customer. Hooray. Because they're going to be a national champion. And then some other stuff happened. So Ben Kilbey, I'm sorry to poke a stick in perhaps an old wound, but you, who were involved with British Volt, might have better view than most. So I guess, what's the view about, I'm not going to ask you to rehash everything that happened there, but, like, essentially, like, post that, what is the view about the viability of a domestic supply chain and ecosystem for producing batteries, including the lithium that Jeremy's going to mine. Again, you've got a range of clients across different things in the supply chain. What are you hearing? What's your take?
Well, thank you for poking the old wound. I think you'll remember the first time we spoke, I said, it's amazing how much progress I've made since January 2023, but the first thing anyone ever wants to speak about is my time at British Volt. But it's been, to go to Freya's point around, there's been whispers for some time of issues at Northvolt. When we were up and running at British Volt, there were whispers then that they'd taken in Chinese machinery and were having complications with that machinery. Fast forward to this week, I was at UK BIC, kind of jewelling the crown of the UK battery ecosystem, the incubator for people's technologies before getting to gigafactory scale, which British Volt were using a lot of. We were speaking about this and many other things and the complexities of making batteries. But the question I asked to Jonty, who was hosting some training for 2 days, was about the machinery. So we'd heard that Northvolt had taken in some machinery from the Chinese and then said the machinery was substandard. And then another iteration of that narrative was that Northvolt had then tried to do things with the machinery that weren't necessarily in the instruction manual. And therefore, so you never really know anything unless you're behind the closed door. But what it proves is the complexities of making batteries. And just ahead of this call, you asked me, and I think you were asking there as well, about Northvolt and its issues. You can't boil the ocean. Let's stream it right the way back to the earliest business plans. There was advice that you could build 2 gigafactories, one in Canada, one in the UK, before even having the money to do it or having built any gigafactories. What I learned at UK BIC this week was something that I thought about, and the strategy was that British Volt could make customized cell ingredients. So the earliest stage of battery cell production, which is incredibly complex, is the mixing. So mixing your slurries to put into your batteries to be rolled out. UK BIC, which is a very small facility, he said if it runs its machines for 1 week, it takes then another week to clean it. So you think about so the point of it being is you can't really pinpoint one problem. For Northvolt, it's obviously tried to be vertically integrated because that's the way Tesla did things. And I think some of the senior management came from that background. I think Peter Coulson is ex-Tesla. So perhaps the vision was right. And Goldman, a leading investment bank, has bought into that vision. But realistically, making batteries is so complex and so difficult that trying to do all those things at once is a recipe for disaster. And it is, I just want to say, it was heartbreaking with British Volt. It was the poster child in the UK for around a year. I had some great times, and then it was crisis management for a year. But really, for me, below that C-suite, the real people in there that people have forgotten about, who moved from all over the world. And I spoke to some recently. They've got jobs, but they're still located in parts of the country they don't really want to be in. We shouldn't just think about. I gave a quote to Argus Media saying, I was just calling out, before you make batteries, you shouldn't really be making cute videos. Get your priorities right. But then I realised that realistically, that could be misinterpreted, because I remember the heartache for people at British Volt. So to the people that have lost their jobs, my heart does go out to you, because it's horrific. But the nuts and bolts of how that business went wrong is it also has tried to do something that the Chinese and Asia are far ahead of us in. And if you look at like a company, Innobat, for instance, in Slovakia, they have decided to partner with Gotion. Now, the sensible move here is to not see China as a huge threat when it comes to batteries, but maybe start to learn from them like they learned from us when we were pioneering lithium-ion batteries in the 80s.
Well, I think we've moved to the point where this is going to be probably a live issue that crosses over from everybody in VC to investment to what's happening in technology to politics, about like how do you actually cope with this. So Ben, back to your point, in conversations that you're having across the board, one of the things that it appears to me is going to be a challenge for this new government is balancing like the wonky kind of like, yeah, we need this stuff, supply chain, with how do you convince people that there's benefit for them or their community coming down the line that would allow them to be able to sign off and support some of the things that might be short-term sacrifices in order to be able to actually get these longer-term gains. I mean, to Kilbey's point, CATL, I heard from Laurent Segalin that there's like, how many employees were there in Northvolt? 6,000 are there, right, before the layoffs. How many employees just in R&D are there in CATL in China? Any guesses? 18,000.
Well,
Like just R&D, right? So like,
ooh,
and so the question is like, what do you do about that? Like, is it insane to try and actually do something that goes head to head with somebody who you, for no fault of their own, because of our, in the West, kind of dawdling, left the field to other people for 20 years. And so this is why they have a massive advantage. So like, it's a really tough story to sell, though, to Joe Soap in mid Wales about like why, like, yeah, sorry, we fucked everything up, guys, but yeah, we should knuckle down now and pay higher prices and not import cheap BYD EVs that'll cost half the price of a internal combustion engine vehicle and last for 10, 20 years. What do you think, Ben?
I think that if the question is, can the UK still a manufacturing base around net zero on which to build a political coalition which will actually advance the net zero transition, it's not quite that we've lost the race overall, right? I mean, there are industries where we are losing the race, and the battery industry is definitely one of those. But the net zero transition is going to require technological change and some reshoring in many, many industries. And there are other brighter spots. I mean, I was in Port Talbot earlier this year, where they are going to build a tremendous amount of floating offshore wind, grazing the port to do that. And with any luck, they will be using steel from the new Port Talbot Clean Steel Works, which the government has agreed to. And so I think there are really positive stories out there of green reindustrialization. But yeah, you're right. I mean, in many industries, we have just dawdled along, even in offshore wind. If we do manage to make a lot of these turbines in Port Talbot, it will be a reversal of the status quo right now, which is that most of these things are made in Scandinavia. So we're losing out even to our next door neighbors, let alone to China.
Well, we'll definitely talk about that some more. I want to just end because, again, I'm very conscious that I've actually kept you over time for all the time I asked for you folks. So thank you so much for doing this. But like, I want to, before we go, for each of you, like, I want to ask you, starting with you, Freya, perhaps, what story you're keeping an eye on coming up, and then also whether there's something that you'd like to plug, because I think there might be some things coming up for each of you on the call that might be of interest to our listeners that they might want to get involved with. So Freya?
True, yeah. What am I interested? I'm interested at the moment in this company, Lightyear. They made solar-powered cars, which got them quite a bit of press. They then went bankrupt, or part of the company went bankrupt, but they're now back and they're working on these like next-gen solar panels. This is like a year ago they went bankrupt. They've just come back like last few weeks with this new funding announcements for the new solar panels. And I heard of another company kind of pivoting. So I'm interested in this idea of this moment being when climate tech companies pivot a bit, and perhaps the business models that get them there in the end are coming out in this circumstance. So I'm thinking a bit about that at the moment. And yes, I do want to plug something. Sifted has an event next week on the 2nd and 3rd in London. And the first day in particular, there's a lot of climate discussions. So come along. That's my plug.
We'll put a link to that where you can take it in the show notes, obviously. So thank you, Freya, for coming on. So Ben Kilbey, I want to come back to you in terms of like something you're keeping your eye on in terms of a story for the next kind of week or so. And then and again, free slot to plug anything you'd like.
Well, I'll always plug the trends is your friend. That's where you can get all of your energy transition goodness. But I would like to say that I think with the Northvolt narrative, we kind of touched on a few negatives. There is plenty of market share for batteries, and as regulation comes into play, when you need rules of origin, traceability, sustainability, net zero. We will learn, we will evolve. Next gen batteries will be made locally. GDI, one of the companies that I'm partnered with, they are making silicon anode, 100% silicon anode. They're a US company. They've come to Europe because of the existing supply chains, including Schlenk and AGC. And also, I'd just like to say, I've just got on my other screen, favorite social media open, LinkedIn. And I just reading something. So the visionaries at Octopus Energy, Greg Jackson, and Octopus EV, Fiona Howarth. So they've actually got an installation here. A UK home can have zero energy bills with a heat pump, solar, and some smart automation. We're aiming to build 100,000 zero bills homes by 2030. So there are loads of positives for this country. We've got a new government. It's very proactive, especially in the renewables sector. The only thing I was slightly disappointed was it didn't mention EVs at its conference, which is a key part of its manifesto.
I hate to correct you there, Ben, but again, so if you probably haven't had a chance to hear the episode that came out earlier today yet, but in the supercut, at least one speaker from the podium in the ACC in Liverpool actually did, and we put that in the supercut, tout the fact that he had been a speaker before and a delegate before, but had never before driven his EV to come to conference. And so but also he noted, as you did, that why are we not talking about this? And he was the first one to mention it. So I think both slight correction, but also I think in the spirit of what you're saying, I think that's probably absolutely correct. So super interesting. And we will definitely come back to that. And yeah, we'd love to get Fiona on the show sometime. So if you can help us out with that, would be awesome. And
100%.
Ben Cooke of the Times. Ben, what are you watching? What are you going to be reporting on next couple of weeks? And also, I believe, because again, careful readers and listeners to this show will know that we have taken done a little bit of a deal with you guys and helping to promote your event coming up. So what story are you watching? And then tell us about the event.
Well, in terms of what I'm working on right now, I'm actually working on a series of articles about Labour's net zero in train, if you like, all the stuff it has to be getting on with to get up to speed with its climate goals. So I feel like my attention is currently scattered here, there, and everywhere between green steel, whether we can install enough chargers for heavy electric, whether the government is doing anything at all about the risk of Gulf Stream collapse, which is a lovely, cheerful topic.
Yeah. Hold that thought. There's a chap who we've had on the show before called Dr. Anatol Lieven, who had a piece in The Guardian about exactly this a couple of days ago. We're speaking to him tomorrow to tape an episode where he'll be talking more about that. He's actually like a political scientist and security guy.
It's some scary stuff, which maybe we can talk about further. But yeah, in terms of what I would like to promote, I've been helping organize a thing called the Times Earth Summit, which will be happening in London on October the 15th. It's going to be, I suppose, largely business conference covering everything from how the energy industry is changing and working with the government to fulfill its 2030 clean energy goal, to what businesses like IKEA are up to and OVO Energy to make sure their workforces are keeping pace with the demand for green skills. And we'll also be hearing from an amazing range of speakers like Steve Reed, the Environment Secretary, and Michael Liebreich, the energy analyst, and Freddie Otto, the climate scientist. And so I'm really excited to see it all come together, and it would be really good to see some of your listeners here there if they fancy it. But of course, you too, Richard.
Well, thank you. I suppose we, as we've done before, a previous newsletter and episode, we will definitely put links in the show notes to where people can acquire tickets to that. I'm not sure if this is true or not, like whether early bird tickets are still available, but so we'll definitely put the links back up, and if hopefully they will be. But look, thank you all so much. Such a busy week. I hope we can get you all back to talk more. There's so many things I would have liked to have covered that we didn't have time for. So Ben Kilbey of Bold VOODOO, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to close out with something that I nearly forgot, but Ben reminded me. Ben with the hair reminded me about collapse of ecosystems. I think I flagged it to Ben previously on a WhatsApp. Sasha Dench, the human swan, is now Flights of the Vulture, which will highlight how vultures in India, their decimation is basically caused a huge issue with rats, rabid dogs infecting humans,
Wow.
and how one bird can make such a difference to an entire ecosystem. Ben, I will flag it to you again. I'll give you a call.
Yes.
It's super interesting. I think you'll love it.
Sorry,
Well, there you go. You heard it here first before Ben even reports on it. But Freya, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Hope we get you back soon. And then Ben Cooke from The Times. Again, super excited about both of your events coming up. And again, I look forward to hearing more about the Flight of the Vultures. Ben Kilbey, thank you all for coming, and we will be back soon.
Thank you for having us. Keep up the great work.
Thanks very much.
Over to you, Theo.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps others find the show. For an ad-free experience, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll get our newsletter, show notes, and exclusive content. Wicked Problems explores the intersection of people, politics, technology, and capital, and whether it creates a future you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delevan, with production assistance from me, Theodore Delevan. Special thanks to Suncharmer for our phenomenal theme music. Thanks for listening.
Pharaohs for my love, I'd pluck a red rose.